Imagine waking up one ordinary morning and realizing that the price flashing on the fuel pump outside your window is no longer just a number, but a warning signal from a world in crisis. Imagine container ships waiting in tense silence off troubled coasts, their engines idling as they calculate whether to risk a war-zone sea lane or burn days of extra fuel rerouting around an entire continent. Imagine policymakers in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Brussels, and New Delhi staring at the same oil price chart, but drawing completely different conclusions about what must happen next. Asterisk. Imagine the camera gliding over dark ocean waters at dawn, following a lone supertanker as it cuts through the waves toward the most dangerous shipping lanes on Earth. The voice is calm but urgent, explaining that this ship, and thousands like it, are the bloodstream of the global economy, carrying crude oil and refined products that keep cars moving, planes flying, and factories humming. Every spark of conflict, every missile launched in the Middle East, every new sanction or retaliatory strike, sends a shiver through these sea routes and, in turn, through the veins of the entire world. Imagine cutting suddenly from the open sea to a cramped kitchen in Europe, where a family studies their monthly bills, circling the rising cost of fuel and transport with red ink. Then to an Indian cab driver in Mumbai, watching the meter tick up more slowly than his fuel expenses. Then to a suburban American family at a gas station, where the father forces a smile while secretly calculating what else they will have to cut from the budget this month. This is not just an oil market adjustment. This is a full-scale global oil crisis, shaped and sharpened by the strategic choices of the United States and Israel, and by the escalating confrontation with Iran that now threatens to redraw the energy map of our time. Asterisk. Imagine rewinding history and watching the modern world being built in fast-forward, highways spiderwebbing across continents, jetliners filling the skies, megacities glowing with artificial light. Behind every frame, there is one constant: fossil fuel. Oil quickly became the indispensable commodity of the 20th and 21st centuries, creating what economists call hydrocarbon dependency on a planetary scale. The global energy architecture locked governments and corporations into a pattern of consumption that made Middle Eastern crude the linchpin of industrial civilization. In this chapter, you explain concepts like energy security, strategic reserves, and supply-side vulnerability. You walk the audience through how a handful of geographic choke points, especially the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea corridor, turned into systemic single points of failure. Imagine showing a digital globe where major shipping lanes light up like arteries, pulsing with cargo and crude. Overlay statistics and expert commentary to reveal how deeply integrated global supply chains became, and how exposed they are to geopolitical shock events. Asterisk. Now, imagine the camera descending over the Middle East as the narration shifts to the current conflict. We see maps tracing missile trails, airstrikes, and naval maneuvers between the US, Israel, and Iran. This is not an isolated regional skirmish, it is what analysts call a high-intensity, multi-theater conflict with direct implications for global energy flows. The escalation dynamic is described using terms like deterrence failure, proxy warfare, and escalation ladder, underscoring how instability propagates into markets through fear and uncertainty. You deepen the segment by showing intelligence-style graphics of radar signatures and satellite images of damaged infrastructure. The script explains how each retaliatory strike increases what traders call the geopolitical risk premium on a barrel of oil. Futures markets, derivatives, and hedging strategies come into play. Imagine cutting to a trading floor where screens glow with real-time price movements and volatility indices. When a strike is announced, the VIX jumps, Brent futures spike, and the cost of insuring tankers skyrockets, all while most people are simply sleeping, unaware that their next fuel bill is already being rewritten. Asterisk. Imagine zooming into the Red Sea, one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world. Here, Yemen's Houthi movement has transformed shipping lanes into contested battle space, launching drone and missile attacks that turn commercial vessels into potential targets overnight. The script introduces terms like maritime choke point, sea denial, and asymmetric naval warfare. We explain how relatively low-cost missiles and drones can impose what strategists describe as disproportionate economic costs on global trade. You illustrate the consequences with a sequence illustrating supply chain rerouting. Imagine an animated map showing tankers that once moved straight through the Suez-Red Sea axis now swinging around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of kilometers to each voyage. The breaks down the cascading effects: higher bunker fuel consumption, longer transit times, reduced tanker availability, and increased freight rates. This is where the jargon of logistics, time charter equivalent, freight rate index, vessel utilization meets the reality of consumer inflation. Asterisk. Imagine stepping into the Situation Rooms of Washington and Tel Aviv. On one wall, live satellite feeds of the Gulf and the Levant; on another, oil price charts and risk assessments from intelligence agencies and think tanks. The US, still the world's preeminent military power, frames its role as protecting freedom of navigation and upholding deterrence credibility. Israel focuses on strategic depth, force projection, and preemptive defense against Iran and its proxies. Yet every intensification of this security posture introduces what economists call policy-induced uncertainty into global markets. In your narration, you speak of the sanctions regimes, secondary sanctions, and energy leverage. Explain how U.S. sanctions on Iranian oil exports and financial channels act as an instrument of economic statecraft, deliberately constraining supply and signaling pressure. At the same time, show how naval deployments and joint operations are described as confidence-building measures for allies but interpreted by markets as signals of potential wider conflict. This duality, stabilizer and destabilizer, sits at the heart of the U.S. role in the current oil crisis. Asterisk. Imagine looking at the Strait of Hormuz from Tehran's point of view. This narrow waterway, through which a massive share of world oil exports pass daily, is Iran's ultimate strategic leverage. Your script introduces the idea of choke point leverage and mutually assured economic disruption. Iran knows that any credible threat to close or disrupt Hormuz can trigger immediate turbulence in global markets, providing a form of deterrence even against militarily superior adversaries. You describe scenarios using language like worst-case stress tests and tail risk events. Analysts run models where even a partial blockade of Hormuz, or sustained harassment of tankers, drives prices into triple digits and forces consuming countries to dip into strategic petroleum reserves while activating contingency supply arrangements with alternate producers. Imagine graphics showing oil prices spiking along with indicators like the Baltic Dirty Tanker Index, highlighting how shipping and crude markets are tightly coupled in this theater of tension. Asterisk. Imagine a split screen: on one side, the live feed of an air attack in the Gulf; on the other, a line chart of Brent crude jumping minute by minute. Spot price, futures curve, backwardation versus contango, and how traders incorporate war premiums into pricing. When rumors of an attack surface, algorithmic trading systems, high-frequency trading and event-driven strategies react in milliseconds, amplifying volatility across exchanges. You take time to explain in simple terms how price discovery works in commodity markets and how institutional investors, hedge funds, and oil majors use hedging and risk management frameworks to protect themselves. But then you contrast this with the total lack of hedging available to ordinary citizens. For them, there is only the retail pump price, which reflects not just costs and taxes but also the accumulated risk and speculation of the entire global system. Asterisk. Paris, Berlin, Rome, Warsaw. You overlay this with the phrase double energy shock. First, the war in Ukraine severed long-standing energy ties with Russia, triggering what was called an unprecedented energy transition under duress. Now, the Middle East crisis compounds this vulnerability. European policymakers talk in terms of diversification of supply, LNG regasification capacity, and demand-side management. In this extended treatment, you show how higher oil and LNG prices feed into headline inflation, core inflation, and input cost inflation for key industries. Economists speak of stagflation risk, low growth combined with high inflation, while central banks face the dilemma of whether to tighten monetary policy and risk recession or tolerate higher prices to protect fragile recoveries. The camera lingers on truckers, logistics companies, and ordinary commuters who experience this macroeconomic jargon simply as reduced real incomes and increased anxiety. Asterisk. Imagine standing on a Texas shale field, watching pump jacks move rhythmically against a vast sky, then cutting to a gas station in Ohio where a digital board updates its prices daily. The United States, thanks to the shale revolution, is a major hydrocarbon producer, yet it remains deeply entangled in the global pricing mechanism. American policymakers routinely reference energy independence, but the reality is more nuanced. the US is integrated into a global market where benchmark prices reflect global shocks. Here, you enrich the script with terms like upstream production, midstream infrastructure, and downstream refining. You explain how refinery configurations, export commitments, and domestic demand profiles constrain how much insulation US consumers really have. As the US deepens its military engagement alongside Israel, it effectively links its own domestic cost of living to the escalation level of a distant conflict. This is the paradox of being both security guarantor and price taker in the oil market. Asterisk. Imagine a bustling Indian city, dense with traffic, where every autorickshaw, bus, and motorbike depends on imported fuel. India's strategic vocabulary includes phrases like energy basket diversification, rupee-denominated trade, and strategic crude stockpiling. As a rapidly growing, import-dependent economy, India employs a complex mix of long-term contracts, spot purchases, and discounted barrels from sanctioned producers to manage its vulnerabilities. In this extended segment, you delve into how rising oil prices affect India's current account deficit, fiscal space, and headline inflation. Policy discussions revolve around fuel excise duties, subsidies, and the delicate balance between shielding consumers and maintaining public finances. You show scenes of taxi drivers, small transport operators, and middle-class families who feel every minor adjustment in pump prices. At the same time, New Delhi is caught in a geopolitical balancing act between Washington's expectations, its ties with Moscow, and the realities of Middle Eastern volatility. Asterisk. Imagine a map highlighting countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, many of which are classified as net energy importers with high debt burdens and limited fiscal buffers. For these states, an oil price spike is not an abstract line on a chart but a potential trigger for balance of payments crises, currency depreciation, and social unrest. Development economists warn of energy poverty and food-energy fertilizer feedback loops that endanger basic living standards. Your script lingers on examples where rising diesel prices threaten agricultural transport, raising the cost of food and increasing the risk of food insecurity. You introduce concepts like import bill shock, sovereign risk, and debt distress. The narrative makes clear that while powerful states use energy as an instrument of geopolitical leverage, vulnerable states often experience it as a mechanism of structural inequity and dependence. Asterisk. Imagine a sleek trading office in Geneva or Singapore, where energy traders scan forward curves, options volatility, and risk-adjusted returns. For some, this is a golden age of arbitrage opportunities created by regional price differentials and shipping route distortions. Oil exporting countries with stable production enjoy windfall revenues, fiscal surpluses, and expanded sovereign wealth funds, at least in the short term. But you use this chapter to question the sustainability of these gains. Economists discuss concepts like resource curse, procyclical fiscal policy, and Dutch disease. The script emphasizes that profit extracted from volatility is, at its core, profit from instability and insecurity. The more attractive volatility becomes to certain market participants, the less incentive there is for the system to move toward genuine resilience. Asterisk. Imagine tracing a single barrel of oil from extraction to the supermarket shelf. You break the journey into stages: upstream production, transport and shipping, refining and distribution, retail and consumption, and at each step, you highlight where geopolitical risk is priced in. Every time a tanker must reroute, every time a refinery faces uncertainty about future supply, there is a recalibration of costs and margins. Here, you explain in simple language concepts like cost-push inflation, pass-through effects, and pricing power. The audience sees how a conflict thousands of kilometers away changes the price of food, clothing, and services in their local neighborhood. The jargon is translated into lived experience: reduced purchasing power, delayed investments, shrinking savings, increased stress. Asterisk. Imagine crowds gathering outside government buildings, holding signs about fuel prices and cost of living. Historically, energy shocks have triggered mass mobilization, populist backlash, and policy reversals. Political scientists speak of legitimacy crises and governance stress tests when governments cannot reconcile external commitments with domestic expectations. In this extended treatment, you show how rising oil prices become a catalyst for broader grievances: inequality, corruption, lack of opportunity. Protest movements that begin with fuel may evolve into demands for systemic change. The language of macroprudential policy and fiscal consolidation offers little comfort to someone who cannot afford to fill their tank. This gap between technocratic discourse and popular frustration is a crucial fault line in the modern political order. Asterisk. Imagine two futures. In the first, the world gradually escapes what some analysts call the petro-lock-in by accelerating investment in renewables, electrified transport, and decentralized energy systems. Policymakers talk of energy transition, decarbonization pathways, and just transition frameworks. In this scenario, oil's centrality to geopolitics slowly diminishes as the elasticity of demand falls and alternative technologies reach scale. In the second future, crises like the current one remain periodic, systemic shocks. Governments talk about transition but underinvest, trapped in what critics call carbon inertia and policy capture by entrenched interests. The world remains vulnerable to every new flare-up in the Middle East, every new sanction regime, every new proxy conflict that can interfere with a tanker's route. Your script asks the audience to imagine which future they want and which one their leaders are actually steering them toward. Asterisk. Imagine, finally, returning to the people we met at the beginning of the film. The European family adjusting their thermostat in car usage, the American trucker recalculating routes and margins, the Indian driver counting the extra rupees spent each day on fuel. Behind every technical term, risk premium, supply disruption, price elasticity, there is a human story of sacrifice, adaptation, and sometimes defeat. The closing narration ties together the jargon and the imagery. We live in an era of weaponized interdependence, where energy is both a lifeline and a lever of power. The ongoing US-Israel-Iran confrontation has revealed just how fragile the global energy architecture really is. Imagine a world where the price on the pump no longer reflects the mood of distant battlefields. Until that world exists, every war in an oil-rich region will be felt, quietly but relentlessly, in the lives of billions far beyond the blast radius.